Começou? A cultura woke acabou com os comediantes. Os comediantes não podem falar mais nada hoje. É isso que está acontecendo no mundo? Vamos ver o que é esse historiador da comédia. O nome desse cara é Clip Nestori. É um nome super complicado. Ele é um cara que é um historiador da comédia. Ele é canadense. E ele escreveu um livro sobre comédia. Eu vou ver depois se eu consigo a imagem aqui pra vocês. Ele escreveu um livro sobre comédia, sobre a história da comédia stand-up, que é incrível. E aí a gente vê como que a comédia stand-up veio de um lugar muito louco, assim, sabe? Tipo, era só uma galera meio bandida, assim, que se metia com comédia, entendeu? Que era uma outra parada, entendeu? Então esse cara, ele estuda muito a comédia e ele tá dando essa entrevista, né, falando nesse podcast sobre essa história do tipo assim, os comediantes não podem falar mais nada hoje, sabe? A gente vive na cultura woke, não pode falar mais nada e tal. E ele fala um pouco da história disso, de como que isso aconteceu já na história da comédia. E eu achei uma conversa muito interessante. Esse podcast esse cara é um comediante, esse Adam Conover, acho que é o nome dele. Ele é um comediante aqui dos Estados Unidos. E eu acho até ele um pouco chato. Mas nesse podcast dele, ele leva muita gente interessante, assim, pra conversar, sabe? Então, às vezes eu escuto. E então, é esse podcast. E depois eu coloco o link do vídeo original aqui na descrição, pra quem quiser dar uma olhadinha, tá? Mas é isso, vamos lá assistir? Bora lá. Eita.
Time we had you on to talk about your book. We had a little real estate problem, which is an incredible book about the history of.
Gente, que é inglês, né? É óbvio, eu esqueci de te falar isso. Eu coloquei um pouquinho mais rapidinho, tá? Só porque é 1 hora o negócio, tá, gente? Mas eu vou colocar aqui o auto-translate, daí eu coloco português. E aí, se tiver a tradução estiver muito ruim, eu pego e vou ajudando também, sabe? Vou comentando pra gente entender direitinho. Então vamos lá.
Of Native American comedians, right? In the U.S. and in Canada, I believe.
It's an exploration. That book was an exploration of, I was frustrated with the publisher, the way they presented it. They advertised it as, he tells the untold story of how indigenous people influenced comedy. But that's not the premise of the book. The premise of the book is, how come indigenous people haven't influenced comedy? It's an exploration of
have been written out of the history.
Indigenous people in general excluded from North American popular culture. And so that book is more an exploration of why and a exploration of how we are coming out of that haze now with things like Reservation Dogs and Taika Waititi and other sort of indigenous representatives and the Scorsese film and all that.
Lily Gladstone.
These are big moments.
Ele tá falando dessa coisa dos Estados Unidos, né? Ele parece que ele fez uma pesquisa da influência da comédia dos indígena, nativa, né? Não sei como é que fala agora. E ele fez porque, assim, gente, no Canadá, ele é canadense, né? E eu também sou. E aí, esse cara, lá no Canadá, esse negócio dos indígenas, assim, o direito dos indígenas é um negócio que a população dá muito apoio, sabe? Os indígenas, eles fazem uns protestos lá e, assim, a galera apoia eles, sabe? Então, eu acho que ele tá fazendo esse projeto. Aí, eu acredito que vem daí.
In modern history that didn't really happen before. It used to just all be racist stereotypes and total marginalization. So that's what that second book, We Had a Little Real Estate Problem, was about.
I thought that was an incredible book. You have a new book out called Outrageous, which is about the culture wars and about this idea that comedians can't say anything anymore, that you'll be penalized, it's about the history of what we now call cancel culture throughout comedy, am I right? Or throughout history.
Yeah, censorship, controversy, and how these types of things are often orchestrated for a political purpose to demonize somebody's political adversary. So these days it's like, it's college students, it's millennials, it's liberals, it's the Democrat-controlled city. There's all these sort of boogeymen. And traditionally, in my lifetime in American history, I've seen that play out more when it has to do with foreign policy, the demonization of another country or a leader, or we have to invade this country because they're a threat. Now, the political orchestration is that the threat is here, that it's domestic, it's this mayor, it's this politician, it's this...
Pelo que ele tá falando, Ele tá falando assim que antes a piada, né? A piada que era... vamos dizer assim, de mau gosto, mas não vou dizer de mau gosto, mas assim, a piada mais controversa, ela era mais dirigida ao inimigo externo, né? Então, por exemplo, acho que quando os Estados Unidos estavam em guerra com o Japão, por exemplo, eles tinham muitas piadas derrogatórias sobre os japoneses, sabe? Então, ele tá falando isso, e agora ele tá falando que agora a gente tem um mecanismo de inimigo interno. Então, os comediantes conservadores fazendo piada de quem é democrata, e acredito que vice-versa. Ele não falou isso, mas vamos ver se ele vai falar.
It's this college, and it's all orchestrated for a political purpose. So this book, in an entertaining way, tries to peel back that curtain a bit and demonstrate that most of what you hear is horseshit, and that the sky is not necessarily falling, even if there are terrible things happening in the world. As far as comedy and show business is concerned, we literally have more freedom of expression today, not less, if you look at the totality of the 20th century and all the taboos that have existed for generations, really, up until this point. Yeah.
I love this argument, especially because as a comedian, there are so many comedians constantly making specials about how they're not allowed to say anything.
Então, é isso. Ele defende a tese de que a gente tem mais liberdade hoje do que antes. A gente tinha mais censura do que a gente tem hoje. Vamos ver o que ele vai falar.
Or about how, here, I'm going to say all the things that they don't want you to say. But it's a little bit of a tale as old as time, is it not? Like this sort of like constant claim that one cannot say things.
Well, in the past, you couldn't say things. If you look at the first 70 years of the 20th century, which is most of the 20th century, political commentary, if it was about a specific policy, was taboo. Criticism of foreign policy was taboo. Criticism of religion was taboo.
On a comedy stage, on a stand-up comedy stage.
Yeah, expressing sexuality was taboo. Swearing could get you arrested.
Yeah.
If you compare what you can and cannot say today on podcasts and satellite radio to the tradition of AM and FM radio, if you compare what you can say on cable and streaming services today compared to the tradition of network television, ABC, CBS, NBC, you still can't say the word fuck on ABC, CBS, NBC. Nobody cares, but you still can't do that.
Ele tá falando de rádio de satélite, que aqui tem esse negócio de rádio de satélite é muito grande. O rádio de satélite tá fora da rede AM, FM, entendeu? Então eles fazem o que eles quiserem. Inclusive, essa rede de satélites que eu vendi meu álbum de comédia, e posso falar o que eu quiser, assim, eles não têm censura, assim.
That. So there's this incredible amount of, to be harsh, you could call it repression, to be more gentle, just plain old censorship, which existed in comedy and in show business for most of the 20th century. I mean, as recently as the late 1980s, Two Live Crew, it's not comedy, but they were persecuted for obscenity. Today we have Wet Ass Pussy. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
It's not obscene. There used to be a taboo. I mean, as recently as 1981 in Miami.
Ele citou a música da Cardi B, que é Wet Pussy, que é tipo vagina molhada, né? Que ela fala, a letra é basicamente isso. Então ele tá falando assim, que antes as pessoas iam presas por falar obscenidades. E hoje a gente tem uma música que toca na rádio falando exatamente isso.
In Miami Beach, and it was very controversial at the time, it was illegal for a woman to wear a thong bikini on the beach. And there was news footage of women in bikinis being arrested for essentially what was considered indecent exposure. Now you have side boob. Now you have side ass. I don't know what you call it when you see somebody's ass cheeks.
Side boob
it's like a fashion.
Aqui,
it's a common side ass.
Yeah. All of the ass, except as long as you got a little string in there somewhere.
I mean, it's a wonderful time to be alive.
Yeah.
But
look at Ice Spice. Ice Spice's ass is visible at all times.
I don't know who Ice Spice is.
You don't? I'm sorry. You don't know who Ice Spice is? This is going to be as viral as when I didn't know who the Wiggles were. You don't know who Ice Spice is? She's shaking her
I know
ass
who
in
the
the
Spice
deli.
Girls are, and I know who the Wuzzles are. Is that the same?
There was an episode a couple months ago where I didn't know who the Wiggles were, and I was roundly roasted and mocked by our guest. And now I'm paying it forward to you.
Are they the offspring of the Wuzzles? Remember the Wuzzles? They're
Wiggles
like half
are
animal, half
No,
Wuzzle?
The Wiggles are apparently an Australian children's act that is one of the largest acts in the world. Ice Spice is one of the breakout musicians of the world. She's a very nice girl from the Bronx.
Has Nardwuar interviewed her?
Has Nardwuar interviewed her?
This is how I learned who's who. This is how I learn who's who.
You are Canadian.
Yeah, well, if Nardwuar interviews them, and then I learn who they are, and I learn everything about everything they've ever done.
I would love to see Nardwuar interview Ice Spice. But the point I was making, I was simply trying to agree with you, Clay, because her ass is visible at all times. And she's always she's in one of her biggest songs. She's shaking her ass in the deli, and she does.
Is that what it's called? Is that what it's
It's called deli. Yeah, and it's about
and
how
in brackets shaking your ass in.
Yeah, it's about how despite all of the Chanel that she has, she's still shaking ass in the deli. It's a bit of an updated Jenny from the block, except for about ass shaking.
Chanel.
Chanel. That's how she rhymes Chanel with Elliot. She adds an I at the end. This is we've gone pretty far afield. But I'm a big Ice Spice fan. I'm just surprised as a student of popular culture.
I like the Wuzzles. And
Ice Spice even has hair kind of like this character on your shirt.
I thought you were pointing at my chest hair for a second.
No. So wait, let's get back to...
Did you know there was a candy in the 90s when the Spice Girls blew up in the late 90s? There was all this merchandise. There was Spice Girls merch. There was a candy they used to sell in 7-Eleven, and it was, I don't know which Spice Girl, but she was like holding a lollipop on the image on the cover.
It was like, Baby Spice, almost certainly.
And it was called Fantasy Blow. It was like gum. It was bubble gum. So don't tell me you can't say anything.
Fantasy Blow é tipo o Pirulito chamava chupada fantástica.
Anymore?
Yeah, so what do you credit to this idea that this meme that's out there that you can't say?
Well, there are new taboos today, but there's less taboos now than there was in the past. Mm-hmm. So this creates a convenient illusion that you can't say anything anymore, especially if people repeat that phrase. Really, the modern taboos have to do with bigotry or things that are perceived as bigotry. Mm-hmm. So things to do with race, things to do with transgendered issues, homosexuality, basically anything that people perceive as a defamation of a people. That is our number one contemporary taboo. And that type of thing has been taboo in certain circles for generations. Blackface became taboo in the post-war period.
It became taboo. I mean, before that, it was absolutely endemic. It was one of the most popular forms of American entertainment.
It was, and there were still people who objected even then. Right. The advent of the internet, I think...
O Groucho Marx, não sei se vocês conhecem os filmes dos irmãos Marx. O Groucho era talvez foi o mais famoso dos irmãos Marx. Vale muito a pena a gente assistir o filme, assim, enquanto história da comédia, eu super recomendo, assim. E o Groucho Marx, ele foi um dos caras que botou até dinheiro para lutar contra a blackface, né? Que era, eles se pintavam, a comédia deles antes, eles pintavam a cara de preto e imitavam pessoas pretas, de maneira derrogatória. Tipo, isso era comédia nos Estados Unidos antes, entendeu? Então, e aí teve um momento que a galera começou a não querer mais. E aí muitos comediantes ficaram putos, assim, gente, é só piada, eu não sou racista, é só piada, não sei o quê. E teve essa briga, teve um racha entre comediantes, assim. E o Groucho Marx foi um que bancou. Ele bancou contra a blackface, assim, na frente de qualquer um. Acho que pôs até dinheiro no negócio aí.
I think creates an illusion that people are more irrational, more sensitive, and more hostile, because that's what we see all the time on social media.
Yeah,
but
you get the Twitter mob after you.
But before social media existed, and this is what a lot of my research is based on, when people hated a comedian or were disgusted with a TV show or were offended by something they saw in a movie, there was no social media to go to. So what did people do? They usually wrote a letter. They wrote a letter to the editor. It was published in newspapers, magazines, TV Guide. And the key word there is editor. So if 500 people were upset about something that was in a Norman Lear sitcom, and 500 letters were written to the local newspaper or to TV Guide, they didn't publish all 500 complaints.
Yeah.
The editor would edit and select one complaint, two complaint. Now there's no editor. Now you get all 500 complaints published instantaneously.
Right.
And I believe this creates an illusion that people are more sensitive, oversensitive, can't take a joke. But if you look at the past, you know...
Eu sempre achei isso. Porque as pessoas sempre reclamaram. Eu lembro que no meu primeiro show de stand-up, eu fui fazer e e tinha uns amigos meus, né, que eram gays e estavam, né, e foram assistir. E aí teve uns comediantes que fizeram umas piadas, né, com gays, assim, meio homofóbicas, assim, né, tipo aquela coisa, né, daquela piadoca, homofobia recreativa, né. E aí meus amigos falaram, ai, Carol, a gente gostou de você e tudo mais, mas a gente não vai vir mais, porque a gente não quer ficar ouvindo isso. Então, assim, sabe, tipo, sempre teve, sabe? Sempre teve isso, é porque as pessoas não tinham voz. Hoje todo mundo posta tudo que pensa na rede social. Para pensar, gente, Twitter era, finado, né, Twitter, era uma como é que chama? Era uma terapia para muita gente ali, eu colocava o fluxo de pensamento dela todinho ali no dia, entendeu? Então, eu acho que é isso.
You know, when the Smothers Brothers had David Steinberg do a mock sermon on his show, he wasn't even saying anything particularly critical about religion.
He was just doing a parody of a sermon.
Yes. And that was considered sacrilegious, and sponsors were being boycotted, and people were objecting, and the Smothers Brothers ultimately were removed from the air. People were pretty sensitive about that back then. And now you can shit on the Bible, literally, probably, and it's not controversial. So it's like, for every new taboo, there's all these other taboos that have long since been shattered. The weird thing to me is that network television still holds on to these censorship restrictions that existed when television was invented and first became an entity in the late 1940s. And they based their censorship restrictions on those that had been imposed on network radio in the late 20s and early 30s. And those had been based on the restrictions that had been imposed on the vaudeville stage at the start of the 20th century. So to this day, a lot of the things that you cannot say or do specifically on CBS, ABC, NBC, and Fox, the four networks, goes back to the vaudeville days. Certainly when it comes to...
Vaudeville, para quem não tá ligado, vaudeville é o teatro... No Brasil, a gente chamava de teatro de revista. Que foi aquele primeiro tipo... Não sei se primeiro, mas é um tipo antigo aí, de teatro, de show de variedades, onde tinha, sei lá, uma pessoa que era mágico, uma pessoa que era burlesco, um comediante... Não, o comediante não. O comediante era o que era o host, né? O MC, né? Então, o vaudeville é isso. Então, quando ele fala os dias do vaudeville, é porque, segundo até o livro dele, né, de história da comédia, o stand-up veio do vaudeville, veio desse teatro de revista.
To cussing and swearing. And if you look at the history of stand-up comedy in the 20th century, there are many instances of comedians being arrested for the language they used on stage. Lenny Bruce famously.
Yes.
But there were many others, a woman named Belle Barth, a guy named B.S. Pulley, a very obscure guy named George Hoppy Hopkins, who was sort of a lounge act who did stand-up comedy and motor inns. He was arrested in Anaheim, I think in 1966.
Ele chamou de lounge act. É tipo assim, era um cara que fazia uma comédia em lugares alternativos. Ele, pelo visto, ele fazia no motor inns, deve ser algum tipo de loja de carro ou de arrumar carro, sabe? Mecânica.
Because he used the word fuck on stage. But the police were not the ones who initially arrested him. He was a comic on stage. People talk about how it's the death of comedy. You know, Will Smith, Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, somebody charged the stage at the Hollywood Bowl. In Anaheim, when George Hoppy Hopkins was performing in Anaheim, 1966, and used the word fuck, there was a citizen's arrest. Somebody came out of the audience and held on to him until the police could arrive and arrest him for obscenity.
It's a big difference between, you know, one crazy guy.
Então, ele tá contando que em 1966, uma pessoa foi presa porque ela falou foda-se no palco. E ela foi presa, foi citizen arrest, né? Que é quando o cidadão faz a prisão. Alguém da plateia falou, tá preso. Porque não podia, né, falar obscenidade em público. Olha que louco. Porque os Estados Unidos é um lugar muito religioso, tá, gente? Depois que eu vim morar aqui que eu entendi. A gente não tem essa impressão, mas
Homeless guy charges at Dave Chappelle with a knife, and then you know, his friends beat the shit out of the guy.
I remember
Stomp the guy, almost kill him. And it's a scary time to be a comedian. Is it when you got 15 friends who will curb stomp the one crazy guy?
Here's another twist on the concept. When the Chris Rock, Will Smith incident happened, there was a lot of, it's always people outside of comedy, like in the press, that are always like, what does it say? Is it the death of comedy?
Yeah.
This is going to happen. It's going to start a precedent, blah, 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 blah. People equated Chris Rock being assaulted with censorship. Will Smith is censoring what the comedian is saying. What people didn't point out is that, was that on ABC, the broadcast, I think, ABC? Will Smith, we get the West Coast feed, so we get the delay.
Yeah.
Will Smith screams at the stage, keep her name out of your fucking mouth.
Yeah.
Keep her name out of your fucking mouth. They bleeped the word fuck twice.
Yeah, I watched it live.
So the censorship that occurred there really was Will Smith saying the F word twice. Nobody pointed that out. They're like, what does it say? They're censoring comedian. I'm like, the F word is what got censored twice. Chris Rock didn't get censored. He got assaulted, which is much worse, probably. But
it's also very funny that, you know, they're there with the 7-second delay or however long the delay is, right? They got the person listening there.
Vocês entenderam isso? Quando foi transmitido o lance lá do Chris Rock e do Will Smith, que o Smith deu um tapa no Chris Rock, antes de dar o tapa, o Smith gritou. Falou assim, tira o nome da minha esposa da porra da sua boca. Então, eles colocaram um blip no porra, mas o tapa... Podemos assistir.
Listening there for the fuck to hit the button, but they didn't have anybody going, hey, should we maybe use a 7-second delay to remove the assault happening on stage?
Well, you don't want to do that. I mean, it was incredible TV.
It was incredible.
None of us could believe what we were seeing and played it back several times, slowed it down, you know. No, you don't want to censor that. You know, they have trouble getting viewers as it is. Anything would be...
I was definitely in the camp of this is good TV. There's a lot of folks who are like, this is the worst thing ever happened to the Oscars. I was like, well, hey, we're all talking about it the next day. Finally, a monoculture moment that everybody can enjoy again.
Yeah, it was like the Oscar streaker. And when they write an updated history of the Oscars, that'll be a prominent moment. You want the weird offbeat moments. You don't want anybody to get hurt or assaulted. And frankly, I don't want to see a guy streak across the stage that much either. But I mean, that is iconic.
Will Smith's very own Soy Bomb, you know? Remember Soy Bomb? You don't remember Soy Bomb? I'm stumping you with Soy Bomb.
I have no idea what
This
he's
is the
saying
guy, Bob Dylan was on stage at either the Oscar, I think probably the Grammys.
Bomb,
and he was performing.
bomb or bum?
Soy bomb.
B-O-M-B.
Like B-O-M-B. And a guy goes and joins the performance, and I believe is nude and is holding a sign that says soy bomb. He was a performance artist who was...
he sort of like the guy who held up John 3:14 at all the sporting events?
Yeah, sort of like that. He was the soy bomb was it was,
what year was this?
Soy I am. He was bombing with
soy,
I am.
yeah. I remember seeing the movie I, Cuba and the
I would say
subtitles.
this was the early 2000s.
See, in the early 2000s, I was doing stand-up at the time, but I was also like grumpy and like opposed to modern popular culture. So like when Survivor became a thing, when America's Next Top Model became a thing, when The Apprentice became a thing, when reality TV became a thing,
yeah,
I hated it. I didn't want anything to do with it. I didn't watch any of it. Ironically, now 20 years later, all those shows are vintage. They're like time capsules. Like you watch, what's the one with Brett Michaels, the Rock of
Rock of
Love.
Rock of Love, yes.
One of the greatest reality time capsules of its era. Everybody has a tramp stamp. You know, the word twerking doesn't exist yet. You know, it's a different time. Now I go back and watch that stuff and I love it. But I love it because it's part.
Tramp stamp é uma tatuagem que, sabe, uma tatuagem zoada que mostra que você veio de uma classe, sei lá, pobre, alguma coisa assim. Então, aqui eles chamam de tramp stamp.
It's partially a vintage look at what America was. All the slang people used is now archaic and gone. So I hate shitty things in the moment, but I love shitty things once they're in the past.
Yeah.
So I love shitty TV shows from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and now the early 2000s. I like watching reruns of Cops because America doesn't look like that anymore. The vehicles are different. The computers are different.
Yeah.
The behavior is different. Everything is different. And so I find that fascinating. So no, I don't remember Soy Bomb, but I'm sure I would enjoy it now because I probably ignored it.
The fun part is Bob Dylan singing his unintelligible song and looking over the guy going like, who the fuck is this? But not stopping doing the song. It's a good YouTube clip. But why is it, do you think, that if comedians were being arrested, right, Lenny Bruce and et cetera, and not just being arrested, but really having to shape all of their material around the idea that like the audience is going, if I tell a joke the audience doesn't like, they are going to walk up on stage and handcuff me and call the police, right? And comedians at the time, I'm sure there were some complaints. Lenny Bruce certainly complained, but it was just the reality that they dealt with. Now in an era of unprecedented, you can say whatever you want, there's a lot of whining among comedians.
I mean, it's still the reality. If you get hired to do a corporate gig as a stand-up comic, you're still signing a contract that tells you what you can and cannot do.
Yeah.
It also tells you how much time you have to do and how you can't go over a certain amount of time. Especially corporate gigs, they say, don't make fun of the boss, don't talk about politics, And because they're giving you a big paycheck, comedians don't yell freedom of speech. They just sign and they do it. Same with the Tonight Show. If you're going to do a late night show, you work with a segment producer.
É isso que ele tá falando. Tem censura, por exemplo, quando você vai fazer show pra empresa, que são os que pagam bem, eles falam o que a gente não pode falar. Às vezes não pode falar de sexo, não pode falar palavrão, não pode falar... às vezes eles, porque eles estão pagando bem, e você fica, e que ele tá falando, os comediantes assinam de boa. Por exemplo, no programa noturno, que aqui eles traduziram mal, mas é late show, né? Tipo, quando você vai fazer um set de stand-up, num programa de TV, você também tem coisas que você não pode falar. É isso que ele tá falando.
Who sees you at the Comedy Store, they want you on the show, but they don't want you to do that bit, they want you to do this bit. You got to change the word shit to crap. And comedians, again, they don't usually go, freedom of speech, how dare you? They go, yeah, that would be great. I can't wait to do Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show, So I think repetition has a huge effect on what people think in American culture. And so social media is nothing but a vehicle of repetition. We hear the same thing over and over and over. Eventually we start to believe it. And it's not just comedians. Everybody hears it over and over and over. Oh, people are too sensitive. You can't joke about anything anymore. You can't say anything. And now, if you do any interview, if you're a comic being interviewed, that's going to be one of the questions. Oh, so this cancel culture thing. Like it's like a stock question.
I know, it's irritating. I need to...
It used to be...
Every comedian has to come up with their own, here's my response to this.
When I started doing stand-up in the late 90s, and I quit in 2006, right before social media, either the best show, but they don't want you to do that bit, they want you to do this bit, you got to change the word shit to crap. And comedians, again, they don't usually go, freedom of speech, how dare you? They go, yeah, that would be great. I can't wait to do Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show, So I think repetition has a huge effect on what people think in American culture. And so social media is nothing but a vehicle of repetition. We hear the same thing over and over and over. Eventually we start to believe it. And it's not just comedians. Everybody hears it over and over and over. Oh, people are too sensitive. You can't joke about anything anymore. You can't say anything. And now, if you do any interview, if you're a comic being interviewed, that's going to be one of the questions. Oh, so this cancel culture thing. It's like a stock question.
I know, it's irritating. I need to...
It used to be...
Every comedian has to come up with their own, here's my response to this.
É verdade. Qual é o limite do humor? Né? Assim, a primeira pergunta fala, qual é o limite do humor? Que saco de pergunta, né, gente?
I started doing stand-up in the late 90s, and I quit in 2006, right before social media. Either the best time to quit or the worst time to quit. I'm not sure which, but there were all these hack or stock questions you'd get asked by journalists. Were you always a funny kid? Were you the class clown? Where do you get your ideas from? Do you ever get heckled? How do you deal with being heckled? It was always the same questions, always boring. And now you can tack on the new one. Yeah. Oh, you can't say anything anymore. Hey, this cancel culture stuff. Yep. It's just what... And really, that conversation initially was largely directed by non-comedians and people outside of comedy. But it's been repeated so much now that it has affected comedians themselves. So when somebody like Joe Coy...
O que ele tá dizendo é que esse negócio de limite do humor foi muito mais imposto por gente que não é comediante. Não imposto, né? Mas assim, é um fenômeno que né? Que uma coisa que rola muito mais entre pessoas que não são comediantes do que entre comediantes mesmo.
Coy bombs. People are like, people are too sensitive. It goes, no, he bombed the same way that comedians have been bombed.
É bombardeou, não, essa tradução tá ruim. O que ele tá falando, bomb, é quando dá água, né? Em português a gente tem essa gíria que fala da água, mas é quando você faz a piada e ninguém ri. Então o Joe Coy, que é um comediante que ele tá grande aqui, ele cresceu muito, né? E ele foi convidado para ser apresentador de um desses prêmios, não sei se o Emmy, Grammy, sei lá qual. E aí ele não foi bem. E aí um monte de gente, ele começou a falar que as pessoas não podem mais falar nada, não pode fazer mais piada. Mas assim, tipo, se você for ver, ele não foi bem. Se você olhar o set dele, as piadas e tal, ele não foi bem porque ele não foi bem mesmo. Entendeu? Não é porque todo mundo tá sensível, entendeu?
Been bombing for years.
Any comic could watch that and say, that's just a bomb. That's just regular old... If you do he was not quite right, you know, it was his... He didn't come out with quite the right energy. I've bombed it exactly that way myself.
Yes, awards shows and the White House Correspondents' Dinner, usually the comedian, even when they do well, they get trashed after the fact.
Yeah, that's why it's so hard to find people to do those jobs.
But nobody, when Letterman...
Ele tá falando que todo ano o presidente, ele faz é como se fosse assim, uma reunião com toda a imprensa e a política. É um negócio meio assim. E aí, todo ano, eles convidam um comediante para fazer a abertura. E aí, o comediante, ele vai, cara, zoar os políticos e tudo. E tem uma dessas que é com o Stephen Colbert, que ele detona o Bush, o que era presidente na época, do lado dele. Mas assim, ele detona o Bush de um jeito bizarro. Mas enfim, então tem uns que são muito bons, assim. A maioria é muito bom, né? Então, eles estão falando disso. Que é é difícil você fazer, porque todo mundo vai falar mal depois. E sempre vão falar mal, porque o comediante faz piada com político, e aí tem gente que não concorda, tem gente que acha que foi longe demais, tem gente que não sei o quê. Então fica sempre essa coisa, sabe?
Letterman did Uma Oprah. You know, he didn't say, freedom of speech, people are too sensitive. He turned it into a running self-deprecation for the next 2 years on his show. Sort of like Mad Magazine used to claim to be written by the usual gang of idiots, or that reading Mad Magazine would make you stupid. You look at the Mad Magazine, it's like the most brilliant comedy writers and artists that are creating it. So it was turned into comedy. Now it almost is turned into like a political grievance more than comedy.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's not to say that there aren't new taboos and that there aren't things that might upset people, but it's far less than it was.
O que ele tá falando é que essa coisa que é um saco, essa conversa de limite do humor, agora cultura woke, você não pode falar, tipo, ele é um saco, ele acha que isso contaminou os comediantes e os comediantes estão falando demais disso. Inclusive, eu acho difícil você encontrar um comediante que no meio do set dele não fale sobre como não pode falar mais nada hoje. Então ele tá fazendo uma crítica, né? Dizendo que ele acha isso muito chato.
Was in the past.
Yeah. It seems less playful, you know? This is a great clip from Anthony Jeselnik that went around about a month ago, all over social media. Where
Andy Warhol.
Yeah, he talks about, your goal is to get away with it. Your goal is to make the audience laugh. You say something fucked up, but everybody laughs. They can't get that mad at you. And that's a way of being playful with the audience's expectations and with what you can and can't say.
Yes.
Hey, I went up to a line where the audience got nervous, but I made them laugh anyway.
Yeah.
That shows my skill, and we're all having a good time.
A lot of people are brilliant at that. Yeah, Bill Burr is good at that. Gilbert Gottfried's good at that.
Versus folks who are saying, my intent is to piss you off, and now that you are pissed off, I'm angry at you, and we're sort of like, on the battlements against each other, rather than, it being like a playful bit of show.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the comic and the natural funniness of the person to begin with. When you start doing stand-up, you learn right away where you stand in terms of funniness. You have an inkling that you're funny because people laugh when you talk outside of comedy, so you attempt to do stand-up. You learn right away, okay, this person is way funnier than I am, and I'll never be as funny as that person.
Gente, eu fiquei um pouquinho aqui pra ver o negócio do meu som. Tá ruim meu som ainda? Ou será que eu tava com o microfone longe e agora tá bom? Vocês me falam, tá? Eu vou deixar continuar, mas vocês me falam, tá? Que eu sei que vai dar um delayzinho até vocês me responderem. Alguém tá falando aqui, ó, qual o limite do humor learning, né? De aprender humor. Olha, gente, eu acho que tem um limite sim, sabe? Assim, não, de aprender você sempre vai estudar. Mas eu digo assim, de fazer curso, de pegar aula também. Tem uma hora que você vai ter que ir pro palco, né, gente? Não pode. Tem jeito. Mas vamos lá. Me fala esse áudio, tá bom.
This person's not that funny. I'm funnier than they are. You learn where you stand. And so for some comedians, if it's not natural to get laughs or it's not particularly easy, then sometimes any reaction will do. So a reaction is better than silence. You're having some sort of effect. So to make the audience groan or ooh or ah becomes a substitute for the laughter. This is especially true when you're...
O que ele tá falando é o seguinte, tem comediante que não é engraçado, entendeu? Que não tem o skill, não tem a habilidade de fazer rir. Então, ele fica querendo qualquer reação. E ele tá falando groan, em inglês é tipo quando você faz sabe quando a plateia faz isso? É isso.
True when you're new. You know, some comedians, when they're new, they'll discover something that gets a laugh that they themselves don't really like, but it works.
Yeah.
So they stick with it and they keep doing it. Bobcat Goldthwait and Emo Phillips in the 80s, they both affected a
Bobcat, eles escreveram errado aqui, Bobcat Wait, ai, o nome esqueci de falar, mas é aquele cara que ele foi daquele filme, claro que a polícia vem aí, uma coisa assim, e Emo Phillips era um cara bem esquisitão, assim, da comédia. Ele me seguia no Twitter.
A strange voice, you know. It's not necessary for the material because the material on its own is funny, but I'm sure when they started, they discovered that they got a greater reaction when they did that voice as opposed to when they did not. So they stuck with it, perhaps for way too long. But comedians do that. You find what works early on, you stick with it. So if a comedian finds something that gets a reaction and they're not getting the laughs, they might lean into it. And I do see that with younger comics at the Comedy Store and some older comics who just don't have it. And I won't mention any names, but we all know comedians that are professionals, they do it, and they're really not that great. But if you just keep doing it long enough, you can figure out the magic tricks behind it of how to get a reaction, how to open with something, how to close with something. You have confidence, you have stage presence. You're just missing that it factor of being truly hilarious. But
and you know, you learn how to...
Ele tá falando, você aprende a comédia e você aprende a ser engraçado se você não ficar preso a isso que te deu uma reação a primeira vez. Porque assim, o que ele tá dizendo o comediante... O tipo de reação, o tipo de coisa que você fala e reação, às vezes você se apega, é isso que ele quer falar. Então, às vezes o comediante se apega a fazer comédia controversa, assim, não sei o que, porque ele tem a reação. E aí o que ele tá dizendo que nesse caso, o comediante que faz isso, né, ele tá dizendo que deveria treinar outras habilidades dentro da comédia para poder ter mais diversidade.
How to tell something that sounds enough like a joke that it'll get enough of a laugh that the show keeps going, even though it was not actually that funny, right? Like that's what confidence and cadence.
Most stand-up is that. Even comedians that are truly funny will all employ certain devices and uniquities. Uniquities, not a word. But what's the example I'm trying to think of? A callback. A callback itself isn't funny.
Callback. O que ele tá falando, ó, ele tá dizendo de um mecanismo de comédia que chama callback. Callback é chamar de novo. Então, o que é? Quando o comediante fez uma piada no começo do show e lá pro meio, ou lá pro fim do show, ele chama, ele repete essa piada. Ele coloca o punchline, né, a parte engraçada dessa piada, ele pega e coloca em outro lugar. E aí, tipo, a galera lembra e ri de novo, entendeu? É isso.
Funny. It's a gimmick, but strong comedians use callbacks, weak comedians use callbacks because it's an effective device. The audience is always impressed. Oh, I remember he said that at the start. Another device, and I don't think comedians even think this intentionally, it just happens. If you say something, if you go on a long rant without pausing, you do it for a full 60 seconds. When you stop, the audience applauds. Always happens. You could be funny, you could be unfunny, it doesn't matter. You stop, the applause comes. So there's certain
gimmicks. It's useful when you need to drink water.
Sim, e tem muito comediante que usa esse recurso, ganha um monte de aplauso e acha que arrasou. Pior que muita gente acredita. Eu tinha um amigo assim, tô pronto, gente, quando eu morava lá.
Comedians drink a lot more water today than they used to.
And that's the problem with comedy.
Yeah, there's a lot of Richard Pryor specials. He doesn't take a single sip of water. You know? Everybody has 2 bottles there. It's like a prop, you know. Yeah, that's the difference between old comedy and modern comedy.
Eles estão tirando sarro que assim, sempre tem uma água, um banquinho e aí ele tá falando que eles estão falando da diferença, né, de antigamente e hoje.
Comedy, it was just a stool on the stage and the microphone. Now, stool, stage, 2 bottles of water.
Well, I think a lot of this extremely tiresome debate. You'll see whenever one of these comics comes out with a new special, you'll see people have the same debate over and over again about what you can and can't say. Oh, that's just the audience doesn't like that kind of joke, right? The audience's tastes have changed, right? And so when you talk about some of these shifts where our new taboo is defaming a group of people, right? Sometimes I look at an audience having that reaction. I say, no, the audience just doesn't like the joke anymore. The audience just believe that that's not true about trans people or black people or whatever you want to say. That's an old joke. Like we have changed as a population and are simply not having a reaction. But how do you compare that to the censoriousness of the past, right? Like, is it the same type of thing as that guy doing the citizen's arrest of the comic you mentioned, or is it actually different?
Well, it depends on the example that we're using. Nobody ever wants to admit that they're a censor or practicing censorship. So when right-wing people, whether it's politicians, legislators, network, when they censor something, whether it's drag queens or whatever, or 1619 Project, they'll say it's not censorship. We just want to protect the children. There's a justification there. Left-wing people is a very similar thing. It's not censorship. We just this is bigotry and we don't want it there. Both technically are censorship. Just depends on your point of view whether you feel it is justifiable or not. In theory, the suppression of bigotry sounds perfectly logical to me. Why would you not want to suppress bigotry? But because of the First Amendment and the dogma that we have about only 2 amendments, the First and the Second Amendment, those are the amendments that people scream about. The other amendments, most people probably wouldn't be able to name what they are.
Amendment da Constituição Americana, né? Que tem amendment eu não sei como dizer assim, mas é a adição, né? Fizeram a Constituição e daí a Constituição tem umas adições à Constituição. No Brasil também tem isso. A liberdade de expressão é um desses amendments. É disso que você está falando.
It is censorship to suppress blackface. It technically is censorship, but most people are not advocating for more blackface.
Right.
Maybe the Prime Minister of Canada, and that's it.
Right. Something where like Netflix literally pulled off a bunch of old episodes of television, like in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and
30 Rock was pulled from a few streaming services, a few episodes.
An episode of the new Bob and David show.
It is censorship. I don't think you could argue that it is not censorship. People do argue that it isn't censorship because they feel that it's good. But I think it is still censorship. But I sympathize with the notion of suppressing bigotry more than I sympathize with the idea of suppressing anti-bigotry. Mm-hmm. And you see both exercised in American culture. A textbook or a book that teaches about racist history gets suppressed, gets censored. Right. Anti-bigotry is being censored. Likewise, blackface or something that is considered transphobic or homophobic gets suppressed. It's also censorship. They're both.
Aqui nos Estados Unidos está rolando em alguns estados de a galera da direita não permitir que tenha livros na escola que conte a história da escravidão nos Estados Unidos. É disso que ele está falando, censura.
Censorship, but depending on what your ideology is, you're going to sympathize with one more than the other, and the one that you sympathize with publicly, you'll probably deny that it's censorship.
Mm-hmm. What about when the audience has a mass reaction about something, right? Like so often when you're talking about the biggest comedians who do the specials about like, oh, I'm not allowed to say this anymore, but I'm going to do it anyway.
I think it's
talking about the reaction.
I think it's a convenient way to absolve yourself of all blame for bombing. All comics, they always would say when I was starting to stand up.
Que comediante que fica falando que não pode falar mais nada, ele tá achando que é uma desculpa que o comediante tá dando de não ter mais piada engraçada e ninguém tá mais rindo dele, entendeu? Ele está defendendo aqui que tem muito comediante que está usando essa muleta do não se pode falar nada para justificar que ele não está mandando bem, entendeu? Basicamente é isso.
Stand up. There's no bad audiences. You can't blame the audience. I always blame the audience. I also, when I bombed, I don't know how comics do this. It's a comic who bombs who just powers through as if they're not bombing. That's what a professional's supposed to do. I could never do that. Yeah. If I did one joke that fell flat, I threw out my whole act and the whole thing was about.
Ele tá tendo que um profissional tá dando água, né? Ou seja, ninguém tá rindo e continua e vai. Eu faço isso também, gente. Quando eu tô dando água, eu vou até o fim e vou embora. Ele tá dizendo que quando ele era comediante, ele foi comediante, esse cara.
about how the joke didn't work and I was chastising the audience, and it became funny because I was angry and indignant, and angry comics are always
I did a lot of open mics with guys like you.
You did?
Yeah. I mean, it's a bad habit at the beginning to be like,
well,
what the fuck's your problem?
It always worked for me for some reason. I could always save my bombing by addressing the fact that I was bombing.
Yes.
And addressing the fact that I was bombing became funny.
Yes.
But, so the idea that
Então ele tá falando que ele fazia o fato, tipo assim, ele não tá rindo, ele começava a ficar nervoso, ele tinha esses truques, ele falou na manga pra poder fazer quando ele tava dando água.
It's the audience's fault. They're the ones that are too sensitive, whereas it's not the structure of what you've put together that's failing. Because every comedian knows as you're developing, you try something, it doesn't work. You think it's funny when you first approach the stage, it doesn't work. You try it again, it doesn't work. Then you start to rearrange the words a little bit. Maybe if I said it like this, maybe if I added that. And then slowly but surely, there's a good chance it might start to work. So that's what you do. When the audience gives you that kind of resistance, you adjust. You don't say, well, no, this is the absolute. Now, there's the other end of it where you might be doing a routine that is always killed and then all of a sudden it stops working. And that could have something to do with different perspectives or...
O que ele tá falando assim a culpa, quando ninguém ri, a culpa é do comediante ou da plateia, entendeu? Aí eles estão falando disso. Então, ele tá falando, deixa eu voltar aqui um pouquinho só. Aqui.
To rearrange the words a little bit. Maybe if I said it like this, maybe if I added...
Você mexe na tua cabeça assim na hora no palco, gente. Quando tá dando água e ninguém tá rindo, você fica, sua cabeça fica assim, ó, como que eu saio daqui, entendeu? Você entra no perigo, assim, na zona de perigo, entendeu? Então, a tua cabeça vai assim, será que eu mudar a palavra? Será que não sei o que? Você fica pensando em tudo isso.
If I added that, and then slowly but surely, there's a good chance it might start to work. So that's what you do. When the audience gives you that kind of resistance, you adjust. You don't say, well, no, this is the absolute. Now, there's the other end of it where you might be doing a routine that is always killed and then all of a sudden it stops working.
Sim.
And that could have something...
Always kill, porque aqui quando você arrasa muito na comédia, eles falam kill, você matou eles, entendeu? Então o que ele tá falando assim é de uma rotina, né? Um bloco de piadas que você já fez milhares de vezes e funciona em todo lugar e às vezes não funciona em um lugar, do nada.
Have something to do with different perspectives or different generations or an audience adjustment. More often it has to do with the comedian getting tired of the material and it just stops working. When did you start?
I started in about, I've been doing comedy since 2002. I started doing stand-up as one really needs to do it in probably 2009 in New York City.
Okay.
2010,
Eu nunca assisti nenhum desses dois, nunca vi a comédia deles.
something like that. I started doing it very, regularly, hitting it hard. Yeah.
I can't even imagine if I had not quit stand-up. I quit in 2006. I have great memories. It's fun to watch people you start with continue on and have success, and it's also sad to see people you started out with die. A lot of the comics that I worked with are dead. It's crazy.
Yeah, same.
But the late 90s was sort of had one foot in the past, one foot in the future. I was doing stand-up when Dane Cook blew up and became a sensation. He was really the first comic to sort of court social media. He was Matt Rife before Matt Rife was Matt Rife,
Ele tá falando do Dane Cook, que foi o primeiro que usou as redes sociais. Ele usou aquele... Eu nunca usei aquele. Como que era o nome? Não. Esqueci. Era um desses aplicativos de música aí e ele bombou. Ele tá falando, ele era o Matt Rife antes do Matt Rife. Matt Rife é um cara que tá bombando aqui por causa de internet, de vídeo de interação. Ele é um cara bonitão e vive reclamando que é muito difícil fazer comédia porque ele é muito bonito. O cara é um porre, mano. Sai da comédia, meu filho. Come uns hambúrguer e para de ser bonito, não enche o saco. Todo malhado, assim, todo seco, sabe? Ele fica reclamando que é bonito, não sei o quê. Ah, meu filho, tomar o seu olho, o seu cu.
I don't know what my point is, but just looking back on that era, Zach Galifianakis was part of our stand-up scene in Vancouver in those days. He had done a show for VH1 that failed. He wasn't a movie star yet, and he came up to Vancouver to film a terrible TV show with Jason Priestley. And Jason Priestley used to come to our stand-up shows on Wednesday nights, and because he knew Zach. And Alan Cumming, the actor, used to come to our shows on Wednesday nights in Vancouver. We had a cool sort of alternative comedy scene in Vancouver in those days that was really, I don't know, all the comics were great. This guy, Graham Clark, who's still in Vancouver, hilarious, wonderful comedian. Phil Hanley, who's a Comedy Cellar comic. He started, I remember his first set, he started there. Zach, doing open mics with him every week, 4 or 5 nights a week for 3 years. It was just a glorious time. And I wonder sometimes, I had a couple lines in my act, I wonder what the reaction would be to them today. I wonder if my perspective would be different. This argument, this idea that...
Ele tá falando, eu tinha algumas piadas curtas dessa época que eu fico pensando como que seria se eu fizesse elas hoje, como seria a reação.
You can say whatever you want and that it's just whining. I wonder if I kept doing stand-up, if I would still believe that.
Oh, yeah. I mean...
Or if I would have joined the indignant crowd, because I had 2 different lines, 2 different acts, I had an insult act and a normal act, and there's words in those acts that are taboo today.
Yeah.
One joke in particular. So I don't know, like, if that joke would be totally taboo today. You certainly couldn't do it on the Tonight Show.
Well, it's funny how our own reactions to jokes change. I remember that, Sarah Silverman used to do, her whole act was saying the worst thing possible as sweetly as possible. And she did a joke where she used a slur for Asian people.
Yeah.
But she used it in a clever context.
Ela lançou gênero de comédia que é a menina bonita fazendo de uma maneira doce, assim, fazendo piada pesada. Ela inaugurou um gênero, tem muitos. A Amy Schumer era assim também. Quem mais? A Natasha Leggero, mais ou menos. Mas tem várias, assim, eu não vou lembrar agora de cabeça.
Context, right? And then the Asian Anti-Defamation League, I forget the name of the actual group, but it was a guy named Guy Aoki.
I remember, yeah.
She went on Bill Maher, and they had a debate about it.
Yeah.
And she was so firm in her position that she put it in her movie that came out, Jesus is Magic. She had a whole segment about this back and forth. I think she sang a song to Guy Aoki and all this sort of thing. And I watched...
Ela usou uma palavra derrogatória para asiático aqui. Um cara que era o líder aí da comunidade asiática reclamou, acho que processou, não sei. E eles tiveram uma briga no programa do Bill Maher, assim, isso faz muito tempo. E ela defendeu muito, fazia piada e tal, e hoje...
And I watched this as probably a 22-year-old comedy fan or whatever in my early 20s. And I was on her side. I was like, no, this is comedy. And there was no racist intent in this joke. This is a joke about racism, whatever, all the things I would have said, right? And then 15 years later, I went back and looked at A, the transcript of the Bill Maher interview, and B, the actual joke. And I was like, oh, I'm on Guy Aoki's side. Everything that he's saying in the interview, right? Where he's actually, you have to look at the broader context here and the way this word has been used for a long time. And it's not, you have to think about the impact on the audience and da-da-da. And I was like, I think she also now feels the same way about it.
I think, though, sometimes spokespeople are not the greatest spokespeople. So that Guy Aoki, was sort of a humorless dude. I remember him complaining about all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
And he was super humorless. And so even if you agree with him, you don't really want him to be the spokesperson. And I see that all the time in our culture today in politics. I mute people.
É o que ele tá dizendo. Ele falou assim, às vezes a pessoa, ela vai reclamar, né? Ela vai falar o ponto dela de uma maneira tão... Sobre comédia, né? No caso. De uma maneira tão sem humor, que é uma pessoa que parece que não entende nada, assim, nem aprecia o humor, entendeu? Não pega. Tem gente que não pega. Então é isso que ele tá falando também, que às vezes o mensageiro estraga a mensagem.
I agree with.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, enough. I get it. I agree, but shut the fuck up,
Yeah.
And so sometimes the spokespeople are not going to be very good at getting people on their side simply because of the demeanor or the articulation. That guy, I remember that Bill Maher debate, and that slur was taboo, certainly in my universe. I don't know any comedian in Vancouver that ever would have used the phrase on stage. It was just, it was too much. It was like the N-word almost. It had that kind of impact. But he was not the type of person that I would want as my spokesperson either, especially not as somebody involved in comedy. He just was so serious, And so sometimes the delivery has to be, I don't mean comedy delivery, I mean just the delivery of your message has to be packaged in a certain way. In a totally unrelated manner, Timothy Leary, I'm a big LSD advocate. I think it's great. I think, in the right set and setting, nothing could be better.
Timothy Leary, eu não sei se vocês sabem, é um cara que ele defendia muito o uso do LSD aqui nos Estados Unidos. Ele virou, mas ele era muito maluco. Então muita gente fala assim que ele divulgou muito o LSD. Ele foi responsável por todo mundo saber o que é LSD hoje. Mas ele era muito maluco. Então, ele também queimou muito filme, entendeu? Então, é isso que ele tá falando.
And I think Timothy Leary ultimately is responsible for the criminalization of LSD.
Yeah.
He was not very articulate. He thought he was, but he was boring, he was bland, he was drab.
Gente, eu não sei o que tá acontecendo com o meu áudio, tá? Deixa eu tentar dar uma olhada aqui em um minutinho. Bem, já me fala aí se vocês querem perguntar alguma coisa, querem faz um comentário aí do que você... do que vocês estão achando.
E agora? E agora, gente? Me digam se melhorou. Eu acho que deve ter melhorado. Vamos ver.
He droned on. He was not a great performer.
Yeah.
Whereas in the hands of somebody else who may be a more adept communicator, it wouldn't have been as alarming. So messaging is important when you're making an argument.
As we start this new year, one of the things I'm happiest about is finally having a plan for healthy eating.
Propaganda. A gente vai pular, porque a gente não pode nem encontrar a as coisas que você
Flash
quer
60
vender.
factually. Let's get into the history a little bit more. Like when you say that so much of the time, these culture war, dust-ups about pop culture are fake. They're put in place by, powers that are trying to propagandize. What do you mean by that?
Well, again, it depends on the example that we're looking at.
Yeah.
A good example today is the idea of the college campus, that there's this crisis in free speech. For a generation, Charles Koch of the Koch brothers, I can't really say Koch brothers anymore because they're all dead except for one guy, so he's the Koch brother.
Então, o que ele está falando tá falando dessa coisa que estão falando que liberdade de expressão morreu nas universidades. E aí ele está falando dos irmãos Koch brothers, eram os bilionários, essa galera bilionária que tinha muita influência aqui nos Estados Unidos.
They have looked to the college and university campus as what they call a great investment. And they want to groom a generation of scholars that will propagate that sort of Koch brothers ideology, that there should be no regulations, this and that. That has been a long game for them since the 1980s. So ultimately, they look for opportunities. How do we remove people that are our adversaries from positions of power and replace them with the people that we train? So the idea that the head of Harvard has been bounced, this is seen as an opportunity.
O que ele está dizendo é que esses caras tinham um plano de substituir as pessoas da política por pessoas deles, esses grandes bilionários aí.
Opportunity.
Yeah.
And so there's a reason it becomes part of the political debate. And when you hear like this hysteria that college campuses are anti-speech and that conservatives are the new free speech champions, there's a reason that you hear it repeated all the time. A lot of these media outlets are funded by the same think tanks that advocate Koch brothers philosophy. You have the Bradley Foundation.
Grupos de que ele falou ali, think tanks, né, que são pesquisas, né, pesquisadores pesquisando um assunto juntos e tal, para descobrir alguma coisa, criar alguma coisa, que é sempre bancado por um bilionário. E ele sempre manda pesquisar a coisas que ele tem interesse, entendeu? Então ele está falando que muito desse discurso anti-universidade, esse discurso de dizer que a direita é que é revolucionária, a extrema-direita, no caso, é revolucionária, é um discurso que ele vem bancado por esses think tanks aí e tal. E eu acredito que sim, porque teve um escândalo aqui, foi essa semana, aqui nos Estados Unidos, de uns caras que eles são porta-vozes da extrema-direita, um tal de Dave Rubin, e um outro é Tim Pool. Descobriram que esses caras estavam sendo bancados por russos. Eles pagavam $100 mil por vídeo. Os caras faziam um vídeo por semana, $400 mil por mês. Esses caras ganhavam só para falar as coisas que eles falam no podcast dele. Eles falam, tudo que eles falam é coisa de extrema-direita, entendeu? Para você ver, tá um escândalo isso aqui.
Foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation, the DeVos Foundation, the Scaife Foundation, they're all billionaire funded. They fund hundreds of different websites, radio hosts, social media accounts. It sounds conspiratorial, but it's out in the open. There's no secrecy to it. You could read Dark Money by Jane Meyer, it's a great best-selling book. You could read Shadow Network by Ann Nelson, another great book on the same stuff. A really obscure book that deserved more attention called Free Speech and Koch Money, which is all about funding this campaign to demonize college campuses and to bit by bit knock down sort of the liberal establishment that stands in the way of this sort of Koch brothers philosophy. So that is actually well documented. It's out there, but people don't really care. They read and they believe what they hear repeated. Because they're funded by billionaires, they can afford to continually be repeating the same thing over and over and over.
Yeah.
You know, Ben Shapiro did not become famous because people think he's the most talented person. It's because he got the billionaire oil frackers, the Wilkes brothers, to give him startup money.
Yeah.
And so there's unlimited resources to keep pumping it out there. He's just one of hundreds of different examples of that.
Wow.
And there's a real irony, just returning to the campus thing, where, the complaint for a decade has been, oh, there's no free speech on college campuses because we've got all these left-wing students who are, bullying the conservative speakers out. And then suddenly the shoe's on the other foot and they're kicking out the heads of the universities for allowing the wrong kind of speech on the campus.
One thing that I forgot to point out is that a lot of the speakers, the conservative speakers, if we can call them that, or the bigoted speakers who have been subjected to protests on college campuses.
Yeah, bigoted is more important than conservative is the more.
They tend to be invited not by the campus, but by private conservative groups that set up on campus. And those private conservative groups, like TPUSA, are funded by the same elements, the Bradley Foundation, the Koch Foundation, DeVos Foundation, and they distribute how-to books, film people when they're arguing with you. You can use it on social media to demonize liberal people. Here's a list of speakers you could invite, and it might be the author of The Bell Curve. It might be Ann Coulter. This is what you do when the protest erupts, an anticipated protest. You invite a speaker to express bigotry. Well, you can assume that people are going to object and protest. So it's not a matter of free speech and exchange of free ideas, but an orchestration of intentionally bringing somebody that's going to incite the crowd, document that incitement, use it as evidence that the school is opposed to free speech, then threaten their public funding if they don't expel those who protested. This is the great irony. The bigoted speaker is used as the example of free speech, but the protester objecting to bigotry is used as an example of censorship rather than another expression of free speech, which it is. So rather than free speech versus censorship, what you really have is free speech versus free speech batting against each other. Once again, the bigot versus the anti-bigot. And unfortunately, in our society, because of the repetition of the internet, people who are opposed to bigotry are being framed as being opposed to free speech. And people who express bigotry, instead of being framed as being opposed to whatever, this demographic or this minority group, are being framed as the heroes of free speech. And this is an incredible distortion that seems obvious to me, but when all the propaganda is being repeated nonstop, people fall for it.
And that cycle is used to bring even more attention to the views of the person who was supposedly kicked off. That
Lembrando, gente, que isso aqui eles moram nos Estados Unidos, né? Então, obviamente, eles estão falando do contexto aqui dos Estados Unidos. Pode ter semelhança com o Brasil em alguns pontos, talvez, mas lembrando só que o contexto é americano.
In almost every case, it becomes enough of a media firestorm.
Well, it's not even just that, but then they also become a person worth funding. So they'll get an influx of cash from the Heritage Foundation. You know, Talking Points USA, again, it's not an egalitarian effort. It is a well-funded effort. These people like Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro, do you really think they're talented? Like, do they have some sort of thing to offer that other people don't?
Ben talks very quickly.
I mean, they're not funny people. They don't create things, but they are a good investment because they will push that point of view. And that goes way, way back. The Heritage Foundation, I talk a bit about in the book, how in the early 1990s, they paid the Rush Limbaugh show $1 million a year, something like that. This is from the Jane Meyer book, Dark Money, to push their talking points, integrated into his commentary as if it were his own thoughts. You know, so that's even more common today. And if you see somebody like a Jordan Peterson who, you know, if you look at him 20 years ago, he believes in global warming. You look at him now, he doesn't. What happened? What changed? Could it be that suddenly he's funded by the Heritage Foundation? Could it be that the funding he receives from these foundations has something to do with the change in position? You know?
Is this something that
ele está falando do
also
Jordan
happens to-
Peterson porque o jornalista canadense, ele também, né, provavelmente por isso que ele está dando esse exemplo, ele está dizendo assim, o Jordan Peterson no passado era super assim, lutava contra o aquecimento global e hoje não acredita mais. Ele está falando assim, o que será que mudou essa percepção dele? Será que foi o dinheiro de algum milionário? Deus, será?
This is the present moment. Is this like a pattern that, you know, has happened in the 20th century?
Well, not really. I mean, in the post-war period, most of what they called think tanks were liberal think tanks. The Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation. The reason those think tanks, despite having the names of industry, the reason they were liberal think tanks is because they were trying to distance themselves from bad PR. When Henry Ford died, it was well known that he was an anti-Semite who had promoted Hitler. And the Ford Motor Company and Henry Ford's son decided that they would rebrand the Ford Foundation as a purveyor of liberal causes to sort of circumvent the disreputable history. Same thing with the Carnegie endowments. You know, Carnegie was considered this corrupt titan of industry who got all these sweetheart deals and contracts and greased the palms of politicians in the late 19th century, then started all these endowments to fund libraries and different things like that. And you still saw those names in the 80s on PBS, funded by the Carnegie Foundation, funded by the Ford Foundation. So in the post-war period, the liberal establishment was far more dominant than the conservative establishment. And things like the John Birch Society and the Barry Goldwater campaign and their resistance to the civil rights movement really discredited them by the late 60s when everybody, when I say everybody, the majority of the...
Civil Rights Movement é o movimento dos direitos civis que aconteceu nos anos 60, que foi, por exemplo, que tinha assim, até os anos 60, gente, aqui nos Estados Unidos, tipo, tinha diferença. Por exemplo, no ônibus, os pretos sentavam num lugar, os brancos em outro. Até isso tinha diferença, sabe? Então, esse movimento dos anos 60 é conhecido como movimento dos direitos civis, né, que foi um grande movimento aí que foi contra a guerra do Vietnã, tinha esses direitos, né, civis para os negros, para as mulheres, para todo mundo. Foi um negócio de direitos civis mesmo.
The population was on the side of civil rights and looked at Martin Luther King as this iconic hero as opposed to a communist dupe, which is what the conservatives wing was saying in the 1950s.
Exatamente.
So anyways, there was a guy named Paul Weyrich who was a lecturer on the John Birch Society speaking circuit, and he would, accuse Eleanor Roosevelt of being a communist stooge, accuse the United Nations of being a communist front, accuse the civil rights movement of leading America down the road towards tyranny, of the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the Civil Rights Act of 64 were going to remove American freedoms, it was a threat to freedom and liberty. This is the type of thing that this John Birch Society lecturer, Paul Weyrich, was saying in the early 1960s. And he would speak for GOP women's groups in Wisconsin, and they would complain to the head of the GOP, why are you sending us these extremist speakers? This guy says that Eisenhower is a communist stooge, he's a good Republican, So this was this guy, Paul Weyrich, in the 60s. And the John Birch Society, for people that don't know, it was the far-right organization of its day, but it was widely ridiculed because they believed the Beatles were a communist conspiracy. Everybody made fun of them. They made fun of in Mad Magazine, one of George Carlin's very first stand-up routines. You can see him do it on the Merv Griffin Show in black and white in 65. Was making fun of the John Birch Society. Bob Dylan wrote a famous song making fun of the John Birch Society. So this guy, Paul Weyrich, knew that the John Birch Society had become a laughingstock. They were supposed to be a far-right, anti-communist, anti-civil rights organization. They did get a lot of traction. They endorsed Barry Goldwater for president. A lot of people feel that they cost him the election because it helped portray Goldwater as an extremist. So Paul Weyrich was sort of like Lex Luthor. He was an evil genius. He knew that the John Birch Society had become a laughingstock. So he completely distanced himself from it and rebranded himself. In 1973, with funding from the Coors Beer dynasty and the aforementioned Scaife Foundation, one of these billionaire foundations that still funds things like TV USA Today. They founded something called the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is still one of the most prominent think tanks in America.
That's probably the think tank most people would name if they could think of one.
Yes. And they basically were the John Birch Society, but without saying those words. They were still opposed to the civil rights movement. Among the first things that the Heritage Foundation got involved in 1974, was a notorious censorship case in Kanawha County, West Virginia, in which Black history was being purged from the textbooks. There was a group of reactionary parents that objected that a textbook taught about the civil rights movement. Taught about the civil rights movement, and it quoted the lyrics to "We Shall Overcome." They considered this communist propaganda, and there was this big to-do in Kanawha County, and it became a big cultural moment. It was covered by the press, and 60 Minutes showed up. The Ku Klux Klan got involved. Now, the Ku Klux Klan was defending the parents who wanted to purge Black history from the textbooks. Where did their legal counsel come from when they wanted to challenge these things in the courts? The Heritage Foundation, the first thing they ever did was provide the lawyers free of charge to defend the parents who wanted to remove Black history from the textbooks in Kanawha County, West Virginia. You're right, it does still sound familiar. So when you see the objection that the Heritage Foundation has to things like the 1619 Project, it's essentially identical. Paul Weyrich was the founder of the Heritage Foundation. He later became the founder of the Moral Majority and recruited a preacher named Jerry Falwell, one of the most pro-censorship organizations you could name. He also helped facilitate the Christian Coalition. He drafted Pat Robertson into politics. He also founded something called the Council for National Policy, which still exists. And in 2016, it was members of the CNP that were advising Donald Trump's transition team. So there's this incredible legacy, lineage that goes back to the 1960s, a long game strategy that was not effective at manipulating people in the 60s. Some people, but not most people. Today, it's far more sophisticated. It's far more well-funded and far more effective. And to me, it's far more obvious, but it doesn't get talked about much. Members of the Heritage Foundation get invited on panels on MSNBC, CNN, Fox. They'll say, so-and-so is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And then they let the person speak. They don't explain what the Heritage Foundation is, what its history is, what a senior fellow means.
It's normalized. It's a mainstream organization now, or that's how it's seen by people.
Yeah, and it has...
Começou falando de comédia, estamos tendo uma aula de história aqui, né, do que está acontecendo. Então, o que ele está dizendo é que esse discurso do não se pode falar mais nada, liberdade de expressão, ele está dizendo que não é a primeira vez que aparece na história, né, dos Estados Unidos. Esse combate que os comediantes estavam envolvidos, né, nessa coisa da liberdade de expressão, ele está dizendo que nos anos 70 era a mesma coisa, e já tinha essa Heritage Foundation, essa fundação aí de conservadores. Foi, inclusive, a galera que escreveu aquele projeto 2025, que é um projeto conservador para um próximo presidente republicano colocar em ação. Eu vou falar sobre isso amanhã às 2 da tarde. Aqui vou fazer live também, tá bom? Se você quiser falar sobre isso um pouquinho.
Has extremist roots, and it's been an anti-black organization from the very beginning, although Clarence Thomas is associated with it, and his wife is still associated with the John Birch Society. But even in the 60s, the John Birch Society would recruit like one black guy, one Jewish guy, one woman, to have a woman say the women's rights movement is evil, to have the one black dude say the civil rights movement is a communist conspiracy, to have the one Jewish guy say that John Birch Society is not an anti-Semitic organization, even though a co-founder was a Holocaust denier.
I'm going to hazard a guess that a lot of these organizations that were founded by censors and founded on censoriousness are now the same ones saying free speech is under threat, et cetera.
Well, it was the same argument in the early 60s. The preacher before Jerry Falwell that was most prominent in reactionary America was Billy James Hargis, who was another guy that was parodied in Mad Magazine. And I think Don Imus had a character on his radio show that was like a reactionary preacher that was based on Billy James Hargis. Wrote a book that was called the fuck was it called? It was called The Real Threat, The Far Left, or something like that. And it did make that argument that they're the ones that are trying to censor conservatives. They claim to be in favor of free speech, but they want to suppress us. And again, it came back to the idea that people were trying to suppress bigotry. They were trying to suppress nonsense that was deriding the civil rights movement as this commie conspiracy, and that the Voting Rights Act would lead to a tyrannical dictatorship. So a lot of the talking points then as now are the same. The big difference is they weren't effective back then, and they are effective now.
I know you write a lot about in the book, back in the period of very heavy censoriousness, how different comedians, different performers played with that, how they busted out of it, right? How they, succeeded in spite of it. People like.
Bom, fazendo um resumão aqui do que ele já falou até agora, então, o que ele está dizendo? Ele está dizendo que censura existe, e sempre existiu. E que ele fala, censura sim, você, essa censura de assim, não pode falar mais de trans, não pode fazer mais piada com mulher, sabe, essas coisas. Ele está dizendo que assim, que é um tipo de censura sim, mas que para ele falou isso, que para ele essa censura é muito mais aceitável do que um outro tipo de censura que é tipo assim, então você pode falar qualquer coisa, não vou te censurar, entendeu? Que ele está falando que sempre tem, porque ele está falando que dos comediantes ele está falando que esse discurso, primeiro, ele é patrocinado e ele tem um viés ideológico. E pelo que ele está dizendo aqui, o que ele está dizendo é que os comediantes acabam sendo usados para difundir esse tipo de discurso. Comediantes e hoje em dia também, os blogueiros, o pessoal do YouTube. Então, o que ele está dizendo é que sempre houve esse embate dessas opiniões. Só que antes, as opiniões dos progressistas, vamos dizer assim, ela era mais dominante. E hoje ele está dizendo que, pelo que ele disse aqui que ele estudou, na história aqui, né, nas coisas como acontece, estudou e descobriu que esse discurso de comediante não pode falar mais nada, de liberdade de expressão, ele está sendo bancado e repetido várias vezes. E que por isso ele está tão forte. Até agora foi isso que eu entendi.
Like Lenny Bruce, George Carlin, things like that.
So Richard Pryor is the co-screenwriter of Blazing Saddles. It comes out in January 1974. It's a hit movie, plays throughout the year. That same year, that summer, Richard Pryor is doing stand-up comedy in Virginia.
Yes.
After his stand-up act is done, a concert, he did great. The local police issued a warrant for his arrest. They tried to arrest him in his dressing room. They couldn't find him. They contacted his manager. His manager sent him to the police station the next morning. He had to get fingerprinted. He was booked. He was charged with disorderly conduct because at that point, most obscenity laws had been overturned as unconstitutional. So if a policeman arrested you for obscenity, the chances are the charges would get thrown out. So they came up with different charges. When somebody was a stripper or if they swore on stage, they would get charged with disorderly conduct. So Richard Pryor was arrested in 1974 for disorderly conduct for saying the same words that were in the movie Blazing Saddles. So when people say you couldn't make Blazing Saddles today, well, you know what? You also won't get arrested for saying those words on the stand-up stage.
You could barely make it at that time.
Porque ele está comparando, né? O Richard Pryor, que era um sucesso, um famoso na época, foi para a delegacia por causa de desordem, porque falou besteira. Então ele está dizendo que já foi muito pior.
Which Mel Brooks has argued.
It was just Like they just sneaked it through that it was barely exhibited or whatever. I'm sure it faced plenty of censorship just across the country. If they were arresting Richard Pryor in Virginia, they were maybe not showing that movie that widely.
No, I think there was a different standard. There was different standards for what was permissible in movies as opposed to network television. You look at how censored network TV was in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But movies, you could get away with a lot in the 70s. But it took a lot of sacrifice because a lot of people got arrested along the way. Deep Throat, I think, came out in 72 or 73. And so that was a result of the Supreme Court overturning obscenity laws. Suddenly there was a flood of pornographic theaters and pornographic bookstores all over America. But the lead up to that included movies that were not pornography, like Candy, which is a movie written by Terry Southern with a soundtrack by the Byrds, Vixen, which is a Russ Meyer movie from 1969, The Magic Christian, which is another Terry Southern screenplay. I'm trying to think of the others. These were not pornographic movies. Russ Meyer was maybe a little bit softcore, but when these movies were playing in 1969, local vice squads, wherever the city may have been, would raid the theater, confiscate the film print, arrest the projectionist, arrest the manager, arrest the person selling tickets, and threaten them with severe jail time. Now, this was horrific because projectionists had no say in what was being projected. The ticket taker had no say in what the movie was, but it was a way to harass people. These arrests started to get challenged more and more and more. This is post Naked Lunch, post Tropic of Cancer, post Lady Chatterley's Lover, post Lenny Bruce, which were the early 60s censorship cases, and Howell, Allen Ginsberg in the late 50s. Each step of the way, each one of these court cases freed things up a little bit more, till by the late 60s, it became obviously unjust that people who were just selling tickets were facing jail time. So ultimately, all these censorship laws and obscenity laws were challenged and overturned, and that period from 64 to 74 is the most interesting if you want to study freedom of speech in America and the difference between today and before those cases, what you couldn't say then. The taboos were far greater then because you could go to jail for saying something that was taboo. Today, if you say something that is perceived as transphobic, you might feel the weight of the world on you on social media, but you're not going to go to jail.
You might lose a job. You might not be hired for a job in the future, but there's a big difference between that and enforcement by the government.
You could be potentially blacklisted in certain ways.
And what occurs to me is, at least in terms of what I do, that in the comedy world, that the legacy of that time is like sort of part of the memory of comedians, right? Lenny Bruce and Richard Pryor and all those battles that were fought as being like, hey, people had to fight for our freedoms, kind of, right? Like everyone knows the legacy. I mean, I think a lot of comics now listen to Lenny Bruce go, I can't figure out why this is funny, but like I can tell it was important. And the strange thing is that this new sort of false message of you can't say anything anymore is being compared to those older days. It's like, making use of this deep narrative that we have of being censored and not being able to speak, but to sort of false purposes.
By today's standards, Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, and George Carlin would be considered woke because they were progressive thinkers of their day, And so, I don't know, my point is, but...
que ele está dizendo é que o Carlin, o George Carlin e o Richard Pryor seriam considerados woke hoje.
Emphasize, because people like to take sides. It's not that there aren't modern taboos. There are things that you can't really get away with saying without some sort of blowback or not being invited again to the party.
I mean, when we're having these repetitive arguments over and over again about cancel culture and comedy and et cetera, you've taken a broad historical perspective. Like, what do you hope that people would see differently when they're looking at them? Is there...
Well, propaganda should be obvious.
Gente, quando eu vejo alguma coisa que está traduzida errado, tu vem falando por cima, tipo agora, cultura do cancelamento. Se não tiver dando para entender direito, fala, mas já tá no final, né? Mas tudo bem.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not. I think we propagandize ourselves because we have a phone in our pocket that we're scrolling through over and over and over. My dad, when I was a child, he read the newspaper every week, but he only bought it on the weekend. So he read the newspaper once a week. He read horrific headlines about horrific things happening in the world, and then he threw it away. Today, we get those same horrific headlines, but we scroll through them over and over and over again. It has this insidious effect, this repetition, which makes us feel almost demobilized by the horrible things that are happening in the world. And I think maybe it creates a state of anxiety that we wouldn't necessarily have if we were just reading those headlines once a week, as opposed to all day, every day, all night, every night. And
if we took a broader historical perspective about what's actually happened and how this stuff is situated,
you would be able to see through the horseshit. The idea that you can't say anything anymore. The
Yeah.
word anything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
The idea that we're in any
Nada.
kind of worse censorious
Yeah.
regime than we were a couple decades ago.
You could make a
Mhm.
very healthy argument that saying things about transgendered people today is far more taboo than it was in 1991. I don't think there's any way you could argue
Yeah,
otherwise.
that's true.
You know,
Você-
same with the defamation
Falar
of
que
a
não é
disabled
verdade.
person, or any number of words that maybe we grew up with, people of our age group, that we didn't think of as slurs, which now are categorized as slurs.
Yeah.
Those are certainly contemporary taboos. But those being taboo is a far cry from not being able to say anything anymore.
Yeah.
You can't say specific slurs anymore. Okay, I'll give you that. But compared to what you couldn't say as recently as the 1980s,
Yeah.
putting bigotry aside, just in terms of expressions of sexuality, criticism of foreign policy, criticism of religion, swearing on stage, almost all of comedy falls into one of those categories now.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, and all of it would have been taboo.
Então o que ele está dizendo é isso, né? Ele está falando que você, com certeza, tem coisas tabu que você, se você falar, vão te enrolar. Entendeu? Se você fizer uma piada racista, se você fizer uma piada transfóbica, vai te enrolar. Ele não está dizendo que isso não é tabu e que existe isso. Mas ele só está dizendo que esse discurso de que você não pode falar mais nada, esse discurso, ele não é verdadeiro e ele é bancado. Tem gente por trás que tem interesse nesse discurso. É isso o resumo aqui até agora que eu entendi.
Nikki Glaser, who I love, would have been in prison doing hard time.
Just for doing pussy
Yeah.
jokes.
Yes. 1962, Lenny Bruce got arrested in Hollywood on Sunset Boulevard because he used the word schmuck on stage.
What is that?
Pois é.
Who even thought schmuck was a swear?
Tem-
Well, they didn't. They wanted to arrest him, and he didn't say anything that was arrestable.
Ah, okay,
And
got
when
it.
he came out into the parking lot, the sheriff's department made him roll up his sleeves. They were looking for track marks, which in those days you could get arrested for drug use if you
Ooh.
had needle marks in your arm. They didn't find any track marks in his arm.
Yeah.
So they just went through what they heard and decided schmuck
Yeah.
was a reason enough for him to be
Wow.
arrested and charged with obscenity.
I think comics today should count ourselves lucky by those
Yes,
measures.
very much so. And to say
Same.
that you can't joke about anything anymore is also sort of an insult to George Carlin, who got arrested in 1972 in Wisconsin for swearing, got fired in Las Vegas just for saying shit in 1969. Richard Pryor also got fired for saying shit in Las Vegas in 69, arrested for swearing on stage in 1974. Lenny Bruce arrested throughout his career. Mae West arrested for doing a play called Sex, which was all innuendo. It wasn't even explicit or graphic. She was convicted of obscenity. She was sent to prison, did 10 days in a prison workhouse in New York, Mae West. So there's just all these examples. And then right through into the 80s, you had Two Live Crew on trial for obscenity in Texas and in Florida. And people who sold Two Live Crew records were standing trial for distributing obscene material. Andrew Dice Clay in 1990, I think, had to cancel a gig in Dallas, Texas, because the DA said that if they proceeded with the show, he would be arrested for obscenity.
Yeah,
Ironically,
delegacia.
they were objecting to Andrew Dice Clay's obscenity, using words like shit, fuck, cunt, and
Yeah.
not bigotry.
Yeah,
or
not any of the massive bigotry in his act.
So today, the aversion to Andrew Dice Clay is for a different reason altogether.
Yeah.
So there are these shifts in the culture. The things that we get mad about are for different reasons. I would argue that getting mad about bigotry is far more rational
Yeah.
and far more understandable. And I don't really see it as a horrible thing
Yeah.
or anti-speech.
I mean, it's maybe a little bit wrong to expect society to not have, any compunctions, any tensing up, any, censorious impulse at all.
Well,
Like,
especially if you consider yourself a fair-minded person, to suddenly hear from people younger than you that something you're saying is totally objectionable. Of course, your initial reflex is going to be a defense. You're like, no, I'm a good person.
Yeah.
I'm not, no, I didn't mean it that way. And so I understand that initial reaction, but we need to get past our reflex to hear what people are saying. And every case is different. Sometimes people have a very valid argument, very rational reason for why they object to something.
Yeah.
And just as often, it might be irrational and totally illogical. But we need to really address it on a case-by-case basis. Joe Coy didn't bomb because people were too sensitive. He bombed because he didn't have enough time to prepare,
deu
or he
ar, né?
chose the wrong material,
Yeah.
or it was a bad night, or we don't think he's funny.
Yeah.
But it's not because of sensitivity necessarily.
Yeah.
But there might be cases where somebody bombs because of the sensitivity of the audience. Every situation is different. Unfortunately, in the culture war, it's all about lumping things together and
Yes.
generalizing.
Guerra cultural.
They're doing this. Now they want to do this. They're trying to take this away from us. They, a giant generalization.
Rather than having a bit of flexibility and an ability to say, hey, you know what, this little bit of tensing up that people have is I'm okay with it because I'm on board with the program. And you know what, I'm not being arrested, and et cetera.
And it's not all a monolith, you know, like there are people who I agree with politically and I hate their fucking guts. You know, I can't stand them.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you once again to Cliff Nesteroff for coming on the show. You can pick up a copy.
Então, é isso. O nome dele, gente, vou colocar aqui, ó. Cliff Nesterov. Ixi, de meu gato, que atenção. Cliff Nesterov, ele tem um livro muito interessante sobre a história da comédia. Eu acho que só deve ter em inglês, né? Mas dá uma procurada que quem tiver interesse vale a pena. Eu gostei muito dessa reflexão deles. Achei legal, achei que faz muito sentido as coisas que ele está falando. Que ele não está negando a realidade, né? Do que está acontecendo. E realmente, enfim, é isso. Me fala o que você achou. Me fala se você gosta desse tipo de live, desse tipo de conteúdo. Me dá também, fala sobre o que você gostaria de ver eu conversando. Vamos assistir junto alguma coisa. Me fala aquilo que você queria. E dá o like e se inscreve, obviamente, né, pessoal? Amanhã, 3 da tarde, estou falando. 3 não, 2 aí do Brasil. Não, 2 aí do Brasil. Não, gente, pera. 4 da tarde aí do Brasil, amanhã, eu vou estar falando sobre. Ai, gente, meu gato, ele não tá me deixando em paz. Eu vou fazer uma live também amanhã, falando do. É do Trump que eu vou falar? Não lembro, mas o meu gato aqui tá muita coisa. Mas é isso, gente. Obrigada. Boa noite. Obrigada pela audiência. E vamos conversar sobre esse assunto, né?